Hello, this is Simon-Pierre Tremblay from Quebec, Canada, and welcome to the Candid Frame.
We all have dreams and aspirations for our lives, which include both good health and happiness. And for those of us lucky to have stability and access to health care, we have a reasonable expectation that we'll have a good life into our 70s, 80s, and maybe even longer. But such longevity doesn't always come free of troubles, as those of us who have or are currently caring for elderly family members know all too well. Whether it's due to physical or mental decline, the roles of child and parent are being reversed. Medical issues such as Parkinson's disease, dementia, and Alzheimer's are resulting in financial and emotional demands that few could anticipate and even fewer are prepared for. Photographer Safi Alia Shabaik faced that situation after her father was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. That, along with mental health issues including dementia and Sundowners, required that she and her mother care for her father during his decline. She had initially embarked on what she thought would be a recording of family history, but instead it became a collaboration between father and daughter.
And I just felt like now I need to do this before my dad gets to a point where he won't be able to tell me his stories, right? And so in 2013, I really wanted to start. I started doing some video of him and logging some of his journey, but it proved that it was slightly difficult for him because of the Parkinson's. And so I realized that instead of being able to log that history, this might actually become more about his current struggle. And we discussed that, and he was open to it, and he agreed that we'll do this together. So we did. And again, in 2013, I started this project, and he didn't have many signs to photograph. So the photos were fewer back then. And as the years progressed, as the Parkinson's exhibited more outward manifestations of the disease, it became more apparent that, the imagery would be more important at that stage because you can actually see what's happening. And it wasn't really until the last 2 years of his life that I became a primary caregiver. I mean, I was there and I was around, but I didn't need to be there on like a, moment by moment basis.
During that time, she made intimate photographs that revealed as much about love and tenderness as they did pain and loss. It was a journey that she and her father experienced together, and it was actually her father that gave a name to the project.
One day, this was already at a point where he could not write anymore. He asked me for a piece of paper and a pencil, and so I brought them to him. He wanted to convey something, and so he wanted a paper and a pencil, and he really wanted me to bring that. So I brought it over, and he took the pencil, and he started writing on the paper, and I looked at what he was doing, and he was just making scribbles. And so I said to him, "Papa, do you want me to take some notes?" And he said, "Yeah." So I took the pen and paper, and he said something to the effect of he was aware that he was unaware that he was losing himself. And he said that after he said something personality crash, right? And I asked him, what does that mean? Who's having a personality crash? Is it me? Is it you? Is it someone else? And that's when he said that he was aware that he was unaware that he was losing himself. And to me, that was such an awakening. It was such an awakening that allowed me to see that he actually was aware of what he was going through. And I mean, I've never heard the term personality crash before, but could that be any more appropriate for what was going on? I mean, it just fit perfectly.
We'll talk to Safi about the many challenges she faced creating such a personal body of work, as well as discuss her varied career turns as a celebrity stylist for Britney Spears, a personal assistant to Grace Jones, and a turn as a mortician. This is Ibarian X, and welcome back to the Candid Frame. This is going to be fun.
Okay.
God, you are nervous.
I am nervous. I am. This is
Why?
because I don't know. I feel like I always blank out when people put me on the spot with questions.
There's no need to be nervous. I mean, we talk all the time.
I know, you're my friend.
Yeah, and this is giving me a good opportunity to kind of dig in deep because we're always sort of talking in passing.
Yes.
And we've learned stuff about each other, but it's like, this will be a first proper sit down.
Yes.
So that's
exciting.
Nice. So your dad was from Egypt and your mom from Texas?
That's correct.
That's quite a combination.
It is. And they met in Berkeley in the late 60s.
Oh,
of all
okay.
places. Yeah.
Was your dad studying or working up there?
He was studying. So was my mom. My dad had come from Egypt to study for his grad school years at Berkeley. Mm-hmm. And my mom was in her undergrad years. And they met at a party.
Well, what was she studying up there?
She was studying psychology.
Oh, they were both into the sciences. Mm-hmm. That's interesting.
Mm-hmm. He was engineering. She was psychology. Yep.
And you grew up here, down here in the Valley?
I did. I'm a California native Valley girl, born and raised.
So you don't get any hints of a Texas accent in there that you inherited from your mom at all?
No, not at all.
All Valley?
Yeah, all LA. There might be some likes in there from the Valley.
I'm sure that a lot of people were trying to figure out, well, with a name like that, especially growing up, well, what are you?
I think people just didn't understand my name. They would look at it and say Sophie, Safi, Safi, everything but the correct pronunciation, which is Safi.
And what's the language in Egypt? Is
Arabic.
Arabic. Mm-hmm. So did you pick up any Arabic?
Very little. I wish my dad had taught me more. I wish I were fluent, but it's something I'll have to study on my own. So
in terms of your dad's culture growing up and the culture from Texas, because some people consider Texas
it's
entirely. So was it just, you were just a Cali girl through and through, or did those sort of influences have an effect in terms of how you were shaped, in terms of your identity? Because I know identity is a big thing for you.
Identity is a big thing for me. I think that both of their cultures do have an impact on who I am as an individual. I mean, I was exposed to Middle Eastern culture growing up. It was never something that my family tried to hide or not embrace. It's part of who my dad was, and so it was a part of our life. I mean, we've been to the mosque, we've been to cultural events that are, Arabic events, Middle Eastern events throughout my life. On my mom's side, the Texan background, I think maybe that plays into who I am more so because her family was more readily available. So maybe I think I had more exposure to that family firsthand than to my dad's family. Because he was one of 7 children, one of 7 siblings. And when I was younger, the majority of them were still abroad. 2 of his brothers did end up moving to America, to California. I want to say one of them came out when I was probably about 7, and he lived with us for a short period. And the other one followed, I don't know, maybe a decade later. I don't really know the time frame. But now 2 of my dad's brothers are local. So
when I grew up in the 70s, when it came to about filling out forms, mm-hmm. in terms of identifying your ethnicity, it was white, black, Mexican, other. Uh-huh. And so that's what I always did because I didn't. Okay, so you had so when people would ask you, "What are you?" How would you respond?
I mean, I would tell them I'm half Egyptian and half American. I'm a mix. But I always enjoyed that question on the questionnaire because I just would always mark other or check all the boxes. I mean, we all are kind of a hodgepodge of the whole world anyways. We have so many influences, so...
Has it changed at all now when you fill out forms? Is it pretty much the same thing?
It's the same.
Yeah. I had to fill out a form when I was applying for this grant, and it was like, they did have Afro-Caribbean in there. So I was like, okay, I guess they got me now.
They've diversified the questionnaire. Yeah.
So you got introduced to photography through a pinhole camera.
I did.
How'd that happen?
My mom enrolled me in a science class or a photography class at the Museum of Science and Industry back in... I'll just say the 70s.
Just down the street from where I grew up.
Down the street from where you grew up. When it was the Museum of Science and Industry, now it's the California Science Center. They had wonderful workshops for children. My mom enrolled me in a pinhole camera class, and that was the day that changed my life. It just was an incredible class. I didn't know that I could create a device that I could take into the world and replicate imagery through just a simple hole, letting light in and closing the light off. I would say ever since that day, I've had a camera beside me.
So was part of the fascination not just the fact that you could take the pictures, but that you could make the camera?
That's a good question. It's hard to go back into my 5-year-old brain, but I'm sure part of it was that, the tactility of making that camera. I mean, we had a 120 millimeter roll of film that we, I think, put in a box or used in the box that it came in and just created that into the pinhole camera. The memory's slightly fuzzy, but I do remember going out into the rose garden and making pictures there. I actually don't know how to answer that.
No, it's fine.
Yeah.
It's fine. You don't always have to have answers. That's okay.
I don't have any
it's better to admit that you don't know than to sort of pull something out of your butt.
Yeah.
You know? Which I regrettably have done all too often when I was younger. Now I know better. But you know, you went to UCLA. You got
Yes.
a degree in fine art. But before you got the degree in fine art, you had considered physiology, then anthropology, and then you got to fine art. And that's quite a twisty path to get to that. So why, if you were so fascinated with photography from such a young age, why didn't you just make a beeline for that?
I also have a strong science side to myself. I feel like I'm this kind of hybrid between science and art. I've always loved anatomy and physiology. And so when people would ask my sister and I when we were young what we wanted to be, her answer was always a lawyer, which she is today. And my answer was a doctor. I thought I was going to be a doctor. I thought I was going to deliver babies. That's the trajectory I thought I was going to be on. Even though photography was such a big part of my life, I never saw that as a profession or a career. I think I saw it as just a passion. And, I loved the idea of bringing life into the world. And so I thought that was going to be my trajectory. I thought I was going to be a doctor. When I started at UCLA, I started pre-med, but undeclared, and I started taking anatomy and physiology classes, which I loved. The dissection lab was fabulous. I mean, I love learning what's going on inside the human body. I think we are incredible beings, and there's so much that goes into us just existing in any moment, space, and place and time that we take for granted, we don't think about on any given day because it's just innate to our being. But I was fascinated by all of the little minutia of how we exist on a daily basis. But I think I got a little disillusioned when I saw how much chemistry and physics and these other classes that I wasn't so interested in, they were the primary basis of that degree. And there was very little anatomy and physiology that you actually studied. And so I decided, well, maybe I'll pursue some other interests. Let me just explore. I'm still a freshman and I'm still figuring myself out. And so I took a couple anthropology classes and realized that I really loved anthropology. I loved cultural anthropology. I decided I think that first year or maybe the second year that I was going to kind of move into that area. And I took a lot of anthropology classes and really thought that I would go to South America and live in the Amazon with indigenous cultures and kind of study those lifestyles and how they live off the planet and just kind of exist off of nature and not with modern technology. And somewhere along that path, I mean, art has always been a part of my life. Like I mentioned, the pinhole camera class. My mom always had us involved in really creative courses growing up. And I think when I was in college studying anthropology, I realized that there was still this desire in me to pursue art and photography and also filmmaking. And so I just kind of migrated to North Campus. I started dabbling in the arts at UCLA, and then I just kind of shifted. So it's funny. I started on South Campus, moved into Mid Campus, which is where the anthropologies were, and then ended up on North Campus, which is where the arts are, and ended up graduating in art. I wanted to switch to film, but I would have had too many credits, so I had to just end it with fine art. Okay. Well-rounded education.
Well, what's fascinating about your CV is the diversity of different things that you've done. Jay Maisel has a saying that he says, if you want to become a better photographer, lead a more interesting life. And you have certainly done that, because when I see all the variety of different things that you've done, it really is amazing.
It's eclectic.
Yeah.
It's certainly eclectic.
Yeah. So let's start with the stuff that you started. You started doing stuff in film, and then you started working with celebrities in terms of being. Well, you can. Yeah, you can tell, because there were so many titles there. It's like as long as my arm.
A lot of transition. I did right after college. I started working in big budget Hollywood filmmaking. I just kind of wiggled my way in. Right. So Catherine Opie became my mentor post-college. She taught me the art of color printing in the darkrooms that she had built at UC Irvine. At that time, she was rising to fame for work she was doing in her community, which is at that time, it was the lesbian, leather, dyke, queer, BDSM communities that encompass transgender women and men, drag queens, and also just the women who would take on a male persona. And she was doing these really beautiful color portraits of her community. And this kind of work had not really been done at that time. I think it was something new and a little bit controversial. So she was getting a lot of recognition for that. She had also done some self-portraits that involved cutting and also BDSM gear. And that was also being released into the world at that time. Simultaneously, I was kind of weaving my way into film production, and I had just taken a leap into big budget Hollywood filmmaking. I'd been hired on a job for Starship Troopers, the film that Paul Verhoeven did with Sony Pictures. I had been hired as an intern and then finally became hired as a transportation office coordinator on that film. So my first beginnings in film were in transportation, where I got to know everybody on the cast and crew. I worked with every department, and it was kind of a trial by fire role to take on.
Yeah, the best kind.
The best kind. Yes. So film production lasted for me a couple years. After Starship Troopers, I worked on Godzilla. And then I got another offer. I got an offer to do celebrity wardrobe styling. I kind of moved in that direction and fell into that just happenstance.
Happens, yeah.
Yeah. And that job was working with Courtney Love and the band Hole. And I ended up working with them for a year on a team, styling them for music videos, public appearances, the Oscars, various things.
That just seems like the oddest job to have, dressing somebody else.
It's a little odd, I guess. I mean, you would think people can dress themselves, but...
Yeah, I know that, but it's taking it sort of a little further, because it's like there's so much strategy behind it.
There's a lot of strategy, yeah.
And that, for me, is sort of the fascinating part of that in terms of someone that takes a role, because it's not about just finding something that would look good on this person. They're recognizing the fact that they're going to get a lot of attention wearing whatever designer and a particular time. And
sometimes things are created for that moment, too. It's not always just pulling from designer racks. It's also creating things from scratch. After working with Courtney Love and Hole, I freelanced for a little while and then started assisting two guys who were a styling duo, Kurt and Bart. They're out of New York, and they were really creative guys who would design the outfits for Britney Spears. I was working with them with Britney Spears, and they would actually create the clothing. They wouldn't be pulling from racks. They would be designing. And
so what did people, when they looked at you and they saw the stuff that you were doing previously, what did they pick up about you that go, oh, she'd be good for this? Or was it just an issue of just personality, and then they felt like, oh, I could deal working with her?
Probably a combination of a few things, like being in the inner circle and having your name passed around, meeting people at the right time. Kurt and Bart were kind of in the Courtney Love circle, so I had met them before assisting them. Even though they were out of New York, they were in LA for various things when I was working with Courtney. And so our circle was, our circles overlapped. And during that phase is when I moved to New York. And so all of a sudden now I'm in a better proximity, to assist them on projects. So I had already started helping them with Britney when I was in LA. And when I transitioned and moved to New York, that venture continued. On another side of things, a friend had introduced me to Grace Jones prior to me moving to New York, because she lived in New York at the time and was looking for somebody to help her out, actually to start a production company for her, which is originally what my friend had basically told me the job position would be. When I got to New York, that wasn't quite ready to start. She was not at a place to start the production company, but she needed a stylist and she needed a personal assistant, and so I fell into that role, and she became my solo project.
And you became your personal documentarian.
I did, yeah. I mean, she didn't care if I had my camera around or not. I had this window into her life. And being who I am, I always had my camera with me anyways. And so she was open to me photographing whatever we were doing. So I took my camera everywhere and documented what I could.
And was that this first opportunity that you had to use the camera in that way? Or had you been doing it before?
I'd had my camera with me for Courtney and for Brittany, but I didn't really use it in that way. I think because I was working for someone else in those instances, I was on a team of people and I was not the head of the team. I was an assistant. I did not pull my camera out so much. But with Grace, it was different. I was with her 24/7. And if there was a Brittany job, I would go off and do Brittany, and then I would come back and be with Grace again. So it was more of a familial relationship. It wasn't just a job. I was there whether something was happening or not. I was just always around doing something.
Well, there's a level of intimacy that pervades your work, not just the stuff that you did with your father. So I was curious as to whether it was that period was the sort of the initial birth of that sort of process where you were intimately involved with someone in terms of the everyday events of their day, and you're there being observant, making images, but you're also sort of interacting and having a relationship with them.
Right. I guess you're right about that. Yeah, that was probably my first instance with that. Other than the fact that I was always the friend with the camera growing up. I had my camera with me in high school, and I would document my friends. In college, I would document my friends. But maybe it was more fleeting back then. It was just like, oh, we're at a party and I'm taking pictures, or we're hanging out in the dorm room and I'm taking pictures, or I don't know where that was going.
No, but I have a question that's probably tied to that is
Okay.
your moniker, Flash Bulb Floozy.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I said it right.
Yes.
It's a great name. But did that come as a result of you being the gal with the camera?
Well, I think that I came up with that because, well, number one, my name is difficult, and people have a hard time grasping it whenever I tell them. So I needed something in the time that the internet was developed, and there was MySpace, and I forget what the other precursors to Facebook were, but in the time of social media, you needed something that people could grasp onto to find you in the virtual world. And telling people my name was not such a great way for people to find me because they didn't know how to spell it. They didn't know how to say it. It was very tricky unless they had a piece of paper and I was writing it down for them. They couldn't get it. So I needed something that was catchy. And I think I just had a brainstorm one day and came up with it. I'm a collector of old cameras, so I have a bunch of old cameras that use flash bulbs and, alliteration. My name is an alliteration, Safi Alia Shabaik. I feel like alliterations help people remember. So Flashbulb Floozy was born through that process.
It's a great name.
Thank you.
I like your real name too, but that's a cool name as well.
It's easier to remember.
So you were in New York during 9/11, and I know that had a big impact on you. There are a lot of people who witnessed that and whose lives changed tremendously, and they just decided to take on a different path.
Yeah.
And I think some people would think that immediately led to you as a photographer, but you took on a completely different job.
I did.
Which was?
I did. So I was styling I was with Grace and Brittany up until September 11th happened. And when that happened, like you said, my whole trajectory changed. We all thought we were going to die that day. And I decided that wardrobe styling was not the right place for me. It was unfulfilling for me in the grand scheme of things, just because I felt like I wasn't giving back to humanity or my immediate community in any way, shape, or form that was, I guess, tangible. So I decided to go back to school and kind of fulfill the science side of me again, and I decided it was time for me to become a mortician. I felt like the world, or New York at that time, needed compassionate people in that profession to help manage the loss, the grand nature of the loss that was, apparent.
Yeah.
And I'm a sensitive person. I've been a sensitive person my whole life. And I also had been thinking about things, and I'd been kind of toying with the idea of it anyways before September 11th happened. And when September 11th happened, it just felt like the timing was right. Like I needed to kind of feel this new direction out, and it would be more meaningful for me and the community.
And you were seeing it as a means by which to be of service to the people who had experienced loss.
Yes, I did. And I also, I'd been thinking about a lot of things prior to September 11th. I'd been thinking about, the fact that my parents were aging. I was 3,000 miles apart from them. And I'd already been there for, I guess, just a couple years. At that point, I'd only been gone for a couple years. But the fact that my parents were getting older and the fact that I hadn't really experienced loss, personal loss, other than my mom's mom and maybe a couple friends or their family members, I hadn't really experienced loss, personal loss. And I knew that I needed to prepare myself for that. So that was one of my reasons behind exploring death and dying. Also the fact that we're all mortal. I'm going to be there at some point too. We're all going to be there. It's something that is unavoidable. Also the fact that my dad is Egyptian and the history of embalming stems back to the ancient Egyptians. So there's a cultural exploration there. But I also think that seeing my mom's mom, when she passed away, she had an open casket. And for me as a child, not really having a religious upbringing or, my parents came from two totally different cultures. My dad was raised Muslim. My mom was raised Southern Baptist. And to be honest, throughout my life, neither of them were very active in either religion. Not that they weren't maybe, subscribing to anything, but they just weren't actively participating anywhere. It just kind of left me to figure out my own belief system. And I think part of that led me to death. I want to see what it means. What does it mean when you die? Where do you go? What are my beliefs behind all of that? And, our culture doesn't like to talk about these things. They like to sweep it under the rug. And I wanted to confront it just so I would know what to expect in the future. And the timing of September 11th, brought the biggest impact of death into the forefront and into my face, into the air of New York. You could smell it for like a year. You could smell distinct aromas of burning hair, burning flesh, burning rubber, just these odors that from your own personal experience of like accidentally setting your hair on fire, or, or just these scents that we all know innately.
Was it a way of sort of contending with the combination of both fear and probably some form of PTSD?
I don't know, because I had already been contemplating it before September 11th happened. And when September 11th happened, it just was the impetus for stopping what I was doing and moving my attention to this exploration of what happens when we die. So I don't know if it had to do with that or not. Yeah, I don't know.
What's interesting about that work is I know most people think about what you have to do in order to sort of prepare a body, which to me is the least interesting part of that. And I think because of the losses that I've experienced over the last couple of years, my process for dealing with grief has been something that I've observed in myself. It's something I've been very conscious of. It's something that I haven't really tried to distance myself from. I've sort of embraced the pain, and not because I feel like I need to use it in any sort of creative way, but I felt like I need to own this. I need to be fully present in it. But in your position, working with people who've lost loved ones, there's any variety of different ways they're trying to come to terms with something that some people may have not expected. It happened suddenly, or it may have been leading up to that. What did you learn in terms of the ways people deal with grief during those times when you had to sort of be there to talk to them, to sort of walk them through that whole process?
Well, the thing is, we're with them for a very short period of time, and grief can last who knows how long for each individual. So I don't know that I really got much insight into that working in the funeral business. I think I got more insight into what this vessel of my body means and what my energy that animates me means. Rather, some people call that your spirit, or, I still don't have words for how I describe it, but, the animation, where that goes when you die and what this case is, what it means to you. I think it was more an exploration of that than maybe the grief process.
Okay.
Because funeral directors are, you're trained a little bit in grief, but there are grief counselors who really handle that. So, you see people during the wake, or you see them when they're planning the funeral or the pre-need, but you don't really see them through the long process of the grief.
Yeah, from what I had to go through because my sister-in-law passed away, I think, almost 2 years ago. Wow. So it sort of fell on me to handle everything because my wife and her sister-in-law and mother-in-law just weren't in a place to be able to do it.
I understand.
So it was interesting, and I know it's kind of strange using that word, but just walking through that process, because it was largely sort of a business transaction throughout the entire thing.
There's a lot of paperwork involved.
Right.
Yeah.
So, and for me, I felt like that allowed me to sort of deal with it, and because I'll bring it up now, but I do want to talk to you later about it. This whole idea of that when people think about grief, they feel like it's like finite, right? You get over it, and at some point, it's all done. And for me, especially with the death of my dad, is grief would come up at the oddest of moments. It's not when I'm doing anything specific that's associated with him.
Right.
I remember I was my wife was giving me a massage. I was on the floor, and she started giving me a massage. And I started bawling as hard as I ever had. I was just like, I didn't care how ugly I looked or how bad I sounded. And it was just like...
Well, whatever point she hit, that's where you were holding all of that.
Oh, my God.
All of that inside. So it's great that she hit that point and that you let all that out. Not that it's gone now. I mean, it still exists. I don't think there's any prescribed, structure of grieving or, I think we're processing a loss. I think that is a completely unique experience, and everybody goes through a different process. I mean, maybe there are some similarities, but I don't think there's any one way to grieve. Before my father passed away, in studying funeral directing and all the things surrounding it, and in practicing that, I mean, there was no way I could fully grasp what it was going to be like to lose my father. There was no way I could fully prepare myself for that. Even though I was processing these other people's losses and helping them through their grief for the funerals, there was no way that could prepare me for what I was to experience. This is a new journey for me post my father's death. The grief that I'm experiencing is a new journey for me. I don't know what my timeline is for pulling out of grief or for feeling like I'm done, and I don't know if that ever happens. So yeah.
And it was your father's health that brought you back to Los Angeles.
It was, yes.
So tell us about what was happening with him, and let's start with that.
Okay. I was living in New York at the time. I'm 8 years in now at this point that I've been living in New York, and my mom let me know that something wasn't right with my dad. She didn't know what it was. There was no diagnosis or anything. Like, there was just an observation of the fact that my dad was acting differently than what his normal was. And enough so that my mom felt that there was a bigger problem, not just like a temporary something,
right,
but a bigger, maybe a genetic or like a neuro or whatever. There was something off, right, and different. My dad was not the type of person who would immediately run into the doctor to find out what was wrong. So I felt that it was necessary for me to come back and help assess the situation and try to get him to a doctor or to the caregiver or whoever we thought would be the right place to help assess the situation. And so eventually we did get him into the doctor, and eventually we did get a diagnosis that it was Parkinson's, but it wasn't like, a week's time frame. I mean, this was over the course of a couple years that we finally got him and got a diagnosis. And when we got the diagnosis, he was still functional. He could still do things on his own. It wasn't like the Parkinson's had fully taken over him. The dementia had not come in yet. The sundowning had not come in yet. So it was just a diagnosis, and maybe he had a little bit of muscle rigidity or a little bit of a tiny tremor in his right hand, maybe some, maybe he was a little bit more irritable than normal, like some mood changes a little bit, but nothing that was out of like out of the world, like nothing that was astronomically different with him, but there were some subtle changes.
Explain I know you're not a doctor or a psychologist, but from your understanding, can you briefly describe the difference between Alzheimer's, dementia, and Sundowners?
Oh my, that's tough. Okay, so I will do my best.
I asked the tough questions here.
I am not a doctor, so please look it up online. But I believe that dementia is a subset of Alzheimer's, or else it's vice versa.
Okay.
I can be more specific about sundowning. Sundowning is a smaller subset of the two. It's something that accompanies. I think it can accompany either one, dementia or Alzheimer's, but it does not necessarily happen to everybody who has Alzheimer's or dementia. And sundowning, it's called Sundowner syndrome because it happens around sundown. And it's like a delirium that an individual will experience where often they will say, I want to go home, even if they're in their home. This is a common phrase that has come up, I think, with several sundowning patients. Again, I'm not an authority on this, so please look it up or talk to your medical professionals about it for, the real definition and, symptoms. But it's like another added layer of, the dementia or the mental illness.
And you started photographing this time with your dad, as you and your mom were serving as his primary caregiver, but it was a collaboration between you and your dad. Tell me about the conversation that you guys had with respect to that.
Sure. We actually started the project in 2013, so he was still fully functional at that point. Even though he had symptoms of Parkinson's, he was still, going out and doing things and walking on his own, eating on his own. He was still what would appear to be a fairly normal human being, functioning-wise. And so we agreed to do this project of me documenting him. It actually started as I wanted to log his family history because, my dad came from another country. He was one of 7 children. He was second oldest, and he was the first out of his family to leave that country and come to a new country and start a life. And so I really I'm just so proud of his journey and the successes that he's had in his life that I really wanted to document that. So in 2013, I had been talking about this for years, that I'd wanted to do this. I had expressed it to a friend, and she loved the idea and actually went off and did it with her family. And I just felt like now I need to do this before my dad gets to a point where he won't be able to tell me his stories, right? And so in 2013, I really wanted to start. I started doing some video of him and logging some of his journey, but it proved that it was slightly difficult for him because of the Parkinson's. And so I realized that instead of being able to log that history, this might actually become more about his current struggle. And we discussed that, and he was open to it, and he agreed that we'll do this together. So we did. And again, in 2013, I started this project, and he didn't have many signs to photograph. So the photos were fewer back then. And as the years progressed, as the Parkinson's exhibited more outward manifestations of the disease, it became more apparent that, the imagery would be more important at that stage because you can actually see what's happening. And it wasn't really until the last 2 years of his life that I became a primary caregiver. I mean, I was there and I was around, but I didn't need to be there on like a, moment by moment basis.
Over the past few weeks, while conducting interviews for the show, I felt so much joy. As I sat down with each guest, there was a sense of delicious anticipation of what the next hour would bring. And with each interview, I never really know what will happen because despite all the research I do for each guest, I really want to make discoveries while having these conversations. As people are often surprised to find out, I don't work from a list of questions. I've just learned to trust my process, which includes research, staying present, and listening. More often than not, I think I'm able to offer you something that both entertains and inspires you. So when you contribute to the show, you are not only helping me to pay the monthly cost of producing it, you are affording me the time to prepare for each conversation, which includes hours of research, reading, and thinking about how this person's work and career fits into what we're trying to do here. Though we have occasionally relied on ads to support the show, it means much more to me when listeners contribute. It tells me that you believe that all the time and effort that I put into this thing is valuable. If that's how you feel about the show, but you haven't yet made the commitment, I hope that you'll do it today by becoming a Patreon supporter. Commit to a monthly contribution of $5 or more a month, and you'll be making a huge difference. That's about $1.25 an episode. Where else are you going to get that much value for $1.25? So go to patreon.com/thecandidframe and become a Patreon supporter today. You'll make my day. Thanks. You know, there's a lot of challenges when you're having to take care of someone like that, especially as their physical and mental capacity starts to diminish. And it takes an emotional toll as well. So at first it was your mom doing it. And I guess at some point it was even too much for your mom. And so you had to sort of come in
Yes.
to do it. And as much as the work is about your dad, how did your mom fit in? Was she resistant? She not want to have anything to do with it? What was her response to that? Because it's a really difficult time because over a long period of time, she's slowly losing her husband in the midst of all that.
Right. And I mean, there's other things to think about too. It's like not only is she losing her husband of 50 years, by the time he passed away, they had just celebrated their 50th anniversary. But it's also, I'm sure, a wake-up call about her own mortality, right? Because they're of the same generation. And I mean, you know, it was apparent that I would need to come in and help. I mean, my dad was in his 70s when all of this was going on, and so was my mom. So she couldn't physically do a lot of the work. And it just seemed like, you know, instead of getting outsiders to come in and do this work, I felt like I needed to give back and help. That's not to say that we didn't have outside caregivers, because we did.
Awesome. You need it.
You need it. Yeah, it's a huge, not only emotional toll, but physical toll. So we definitely needed reprieves here and there. And we had a couple of really wonderful caregivers who came in and, you know, felt like family and took care of my dad like he was their own. Couldn't have done it without them. I think that answers the question. Yeah.
So as things started becoming more demanding in terms of his physical requirements, because at some point they can't bathe themselves, they can't use the bathroom,
right.
All of those things. I know that he probably was losing weight, but still physically it's very taxing. You're doing all of that and then trying to find moments to make photographs too. So I can imagine that got increasingly more of a challenge, but you were also realizing simultaneously that this is important to document at the same time.
Yes, definitely. My dad would also say at times when I didn't have my camera with me, he would say, "Go get your camera. You need to photograph this." You know, so I mean, he was aware even in those end days of the project. It wasn't like he ever fully fell into dementia, or you know, he still would go in and out, and he was still aware that we had this thing together that we were doing. Which I think also probably, he was very proud of the project. I think it gave him something to look forward to each day. But there were definitely times where I needed both hands on him. So I couldn't have a camera in one hand and, you know, him in the other. I mean, like when I'm bathing him, even though there are times where I do take pictures of him in the shower, those were generally speaking on days when I had a caregiver in there who was helping, so that I could just focus on the camera and not worry about him falling off of the bench in the shower or something like that. Or if my mom was helping dress him, you know, these were moments that I could bring her into the picture. And you did ask about what was her reaction and how did she want to be involved. And in the beginning, you know, she never likes to be in front of a camera, so she was very resistant to be a part of the project in the beginning. And so in the beginning, it was really just, you know, my dad, because he was okay with it, right? But as the story evolved and as my dad's abilities decreased, I explained to her the importance of having her in the work and showing the family, because it's not just an individual disease, it affects all of us. So she agreed to allow me to make the photographs with her in them. And again, I don't just release stuff into the world. I take my family into consideration, and I get everything approved through them before I share it with the world. So everybody is on board, with the work that's been released.
When your father got to the point where he couldn't verbalize anymore, was it more difficult sometimes to make certain photographs?
He never got to the point where he couldn't speak.
Okay.
Except for the day that he died. On that day, he was not able to speak. But really, up until the day that he passed away, he was still able to get out of the bed with assistance, get in the shower with assistance, to talk. But again, the dementia would come in and go out. So sometimes when he would speak, it would not be sentences that you and I might understand, but then it might be. Right? It would go between kind of I don't know if it was Arabic or babbling, and then into actual words that you could recognize.
This work really struck me. It continues to resonate with me, especially now as I'm facing similar circumstances in my own life. And I've been talking to friends who have faced the very same circumstances. And to say that it's a roller coaster is just doesn't seem to be apt enough, because This is every sort of emotion that you can imagine happens. It's not just, some people look at it, see what we're doing, and go, oh, so wonderful. It's so altruistic to take care of your mother-in-law, your mother in your own house, without them sort of really understanding the demands that it takes individually in a marriage, all that stuff. And one of the things that some of my friends have talked about are those moments where they've gotten to the point where they just want it to end, right? And not that they want that person to die, but that it's just so much. And it seems like, how can we go another day and we don't want to see the person that we love suffering in that way?
Right.
And I've not gotten to that point at all. But I think about the sort of the guilt and the shame that can come from that, and sort of dealing with that. Because I think very few people who are going through that want to admit it, because it makes them feel like they're
callous or whatever.
Bad person. So when you were going through all those extremes, from having those moments, just like I described, to those moments where you're just having just these moments of just joy with your father and your mother, besides taking the picture, how were you taking care of yourself during that time?
That's a really important question, because I don't think family caregivers realize the value of sometimes stepping out of the equation for a little bit.
Amen.
You really, really do need to take care of yourself as well as your loved one who is suffering. You need to make sure you have additional help who can come in and give you reprieve. You need to make time to either take a walk or work out or do something that allows you to, sweat it out, or put that energy somewhere else that's bettering you in some way. Doing the photo project with my dad gave us this bridge together, right? It kind of brought us closer together in a time where this disease was pulling us farther apart. And I'm so thankful that we decided to do this project together, even before we knew really what we were going to encounter with the disease, because when we agreed, he was still, like I said, in functioning order, and maybe he just had a small tremor in his hand at that point. So we had no idea the extreme that it would become, or the fact that my dad would become my child, and that I was changing his diaper and bathing him and feeding him with a spoon, because he couldn't lift a spoon to his mouth or raise a cup to his mouth and swallow, or that I'd have to aspirate the mucus out of his throat in the morning before giving him his medicine. I mean, just things that you would never, ever dream you would have to do for your parent.
No, but in terms of just taking care of yourself, you were...
Oh, right. And so, you have to carve out time for something that you love that is not a part of that scenario of caregiving. And again, the photo project, I love photography. It's my passion. And so to be able to do that with my dad, even though we're dealing with really difficult subject matter or something that maybe I have no objectivity about because I'm so close to the subject of the work, it still allowed a little bit of a break in a way, because I had something that I had to think critically about, right? I had to think about my composition. I had to think about what I'm trying to convey in this image. Like, it brought me back to my world of photography that I do outside, whether it's on the street or portraits or event photography or nightlife, whatever it is that I'm shooting, I'm thinking in those ways. And when I'm thinking in those ways, it's like the world kind of falls away and I'm just kind of focused on making an image. So for me, there's a freedom in that, and it's liberating. So to be able to do that with my dad in this really dire and dark situation of watching him slip away out of my hands did allow a certain sort of creative burst, I guess.
And it's been a little more than a year since he passed away?
Yes, he passed away on January 1st of 2018, so it's just been a year and a couple months.
So
4 months.
How long did it take before you were able to look at the work?
You know, it's still hard for me to look at the work. I still haven't finished processing all of my images that I shot. I have to revisit that, and I need to start to try to finalize the body of work. It's really hard to say. I mean, I had to look at some of it immediately just to not allow it to just slip into the, abyss. I mean, we made this work for a purpose, and I didn't want to lose the rawness, I guess, of selecting the images that spoke the strongest to me, having been fresh in that experience. But it's also, I mean, it's so difficult for me to look at these images. This is my dad's decline. I mean, it wasn't easy the first time going through it live, and then it's not easy looking at it in the past, right? As something that happened a year and a little bit ago.
Yeah, because I can imagine that in the midst of helping them, you're so busy in helping them that those sort of emotions are sort of put aside. But when you're looking at the photographs, you don't have that excuse anymore.
No, exactly. Yeah, you have to go into survival mode when you're in the moment, taking care of the person. And you have to kind of build padding around yourself, even though you're witnessing this thing firsthand, and you are probably preparing yourself in certain ways with anticipatory grief, because you can see the ravages of the disease on the person, and you know that day is coming soon, but you don't ever know when that day is going to come. I mean, the day that my dad died, like, he was acting weird that day. He wasn't able to verbalize anything. He wasn't really eating anything. He had this strange look on his face. And we didn't have a caregiver that day because it was the first day of the new year. They had asked for the day off. And so we did have a bathing nurse come that day. Generally speaking, I would have gotten him out of the bed and gotten him into the shower, but he was acting so strange that we called the bathing nurse to come in and just bathe him in the bed, which was something we had never really done before. We'd only had him bathed in the bed once prior. He was in a hospital bed, so, it was easy to lift him and turn him and whatnot in that bed. But we had the bathing nurse come, and he seemed very off on that day. Like, he seemed a little bit agitated and just not in a state that we had ever seen him before. And I still didn't have a clue that was the day he was going to leave us, But I did have enough sense to call my sister and say, I think you should come up with the boys. She lives a couple hours away, and my two nephews, and they had been planning to come the next day to spend a week with us and him. And I did have the sense to call her and say, listen, he's acting really strange today. I think you should just come up. And so they did. And they got there probably around, I think, like 10 at night. It was late when they arrived, but he was still with us at that point. And maybe about a half hour after they arrived, he left. It's like he knew they were coming. He waited, even though we couldn't communicate as a two-person conversation. I think he did understand they were coming. And he waited. I mean, we hear stories like that all the time.
Yeah. Of all the pictures that you took, which is your personal favorite? I know there are a lot of photographs, but there's the one that right now that...
There's a portrait I made of him that is, I think it's about right here. Like, the bottom of the frame starts about mid-nose on him, and it's the top of his head, and there's a curl in his hair, which I used to do after the caregiver would comb him out and groom him to look really, prim and proper. I would come in and mess up his hair, put this curl in his hair, and I'd made this portrait of him that's just the top of his head. It's his eyes on the top of his head, and I really love that portrait of him. There's also the one of him in the bathroom mirror that has two reflections, one in a side mirror to that main mirror, and one in a little freestanding, hand mirror that's on the counter. And so there are three You see all three of his faces there in each respective mirror. And I love that one so much because I also think it really represents the loss of self that he was going through. And then there's the one where he's in the car and it was his last adventure out of the house. He really wanted to get out of the house, and as much of a struggle as it was to get him into a vehicle and somewhere, anywhere at that point in his life, because he had very small windows of opportunity. I like to call them opportunity because the medicine, his whole life was ruled by time at this point. The timing of the medication. Like, you can't eat an hour prior to that. You can't eat, an hour, whatever the rules were, after that. You have to take the medicine at this specific time every day, and everything, the medicine would take an hour before it would start to populate his body and give him mobility. So everything was based on time, right? The clock became our keeper. So for me to take him on an adventure in a car was really just, we had an hour to work with, right? The second we get him up for lunch, we have to get him to the toilet, change his diaper, make sure he's clean, get food in him. And then, he had maybe 2 hours to eat and get the bed straightened and, change his diaper and do anything that he would need. And then we'd have to get him back in the bed because he would start to go down from the meds. The duration that the medicine would work was very short towards the end. So that photo of him where we've taken him on his last adventure outside of the house, where he wanted to go to the place, and I say that with air quotes because he called it the place and couldn't tell me exactly where it was. That was such a special moment. And when we would get him out of the house into the car, it's like his whole composure would change. It was like just seeing the world again, I think, was exciting for him. A change of scenery from, the jail cell of the house.
My mother-in-law, she loves getting out on the deck. Because when she lived in her house, she spent a lot of time on a porch.
Right.
She's from Mississippi, so they did a lot of that.
Right.
So when we're done here,
she'll go out
she'll
on the porch.
get on the porch, and I just give her music.
She'll be
and
happy.
She's in the back, and then she's singing all those gospel hymnals in the back.
That's
and,
wonderful.
She just wants to be out in the sun, and you can just see when she knows that she's going to be out there. It's just like...
Yeah, the anticipation, I'm sure the excitement, overwhelms her.
Your dad was the one who came up with the name for the project. Tell us about that.
He did, yeah. One day, this was already at a point where he could not write anymore. He asked me for a piece of paper and a pencil. And so I brought them to him. He wanted to convey something. And so he wanted a paper and a pencil. And he really wanted me to bring that. So I brought it over, and he took the pencil and he started writing on the paper. And I looked at what he was doing, and he was just making scribbles. And so I said to him, "Papa, do you want me to take some notes?" And he said, "Yeah." So I took the pen and paper, and he said something to the effect of he was aware that he was unaware that he was losing himself. And he said that after he said something personality crash. Right? And I asked him, what does that mean? Who's having a personality crash? Is it me? Is it you? Is it someone else? And that's when he said that he was aware, that he was unaware, that he was losing himself. And to me, that was such an awakening. It was such an awakening that allowed me to see that he actually was aware of what he was going through. And the term, I've never heard the term personality crash before, but could that be any more appropriate for what was going on? It just fit perfectly.
Yeah, my mom is showing early signs of that. And once I sort of made the connection with it, it started making me understand why she's been as agitated as she's been.
Yes.
Because she could, I wish, just like you just described, she probably senses that there's something going on, but she can't really verbalize it.
Right.
And so she'll just get very frustrated and agitated when she's explaining something or I'm explaining something to her, or it's very strange.
Well, I think I think this was the moment that my father was finally able to express it in a term that I could understand. Yeah, I can only imagine how frustrating it is to have all of these emotions and feelings and things you want to convey and just have it bottled up inside of you because you've lost your ability to communicate.
Yeah. Well, it's beautiful and powerful work, and I'm
Thank you.
so glad I know a person who can create something that good.
Thank you.
But
Very kind of you.
Your other work is just as fascinating. The stuff that you've been doing with the sort of, I guess, the burlesque, is that a correct name for what you've been shooting?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of subcultures and nightlife in LA,
Okay.
and burlesque, neo-burlesque is one of the, facets of that.
And the Mexican wrestling?
Mexican wrestling,
Oh
the
my God.
luchadors and the drag queens, the drag scene. And there's some other stuff too that I'm slowly moving into, but it's a little bit less accessible. So it's a little bit harder to break down the door to get in.
You don't choose boring subjects.
No, I like colorful people. I like interesting people who, push boundaries or live outside of the norm in some way, shape, or form.
So let's talk a little bit about that, because I think it's fascinating, because there's so many photographers who I've interviewed that we talk about the whole issue of identity, that's something that's
Right.
being explored. But it's really sort of interesting for you that all the work, even the stuff with your dad, is about identity. In this case, it's about the loss of it.
Right.
And then with these other people that you're photographing in these subcultures, it's all about creating a distinctive identity
Right.
that is sort of away from sort of the norm. And you talked about your own sort of nebulousness, if that's a word, in terms of you seem to have an ability to. You seem to be more comfortable sort of flitting through all these cultures rather than finding yourself rigidly defined into one
Right.
place. So is that
I think
part
that's
of,
well said.
because I don't see you as really being a part of those cultures and you're sort of doing it inside out. I think it's kind of like you got one foot in and one foot out. And that's not to diminish the work that you're doing, but in terms of just trying to take have an greater understanding in terms of what's happening overall. I know I'm probably, I don't have a psychology degree, so this is probably all kind of blowing smoke, but I try to sort of understand what connects any body of work for someone, because there's always a reason why they're driven to photograph what they
Sure.
do. And since identity is really at the core of everything that you do,
Yes.
I'm really curious to see how you perceive it.
Well, I think I've always been different. And like you said, I do not fit into a box. I think that's been my biggest struggle throughout life, is the fact that I color outside the lines and that I don't fit into a box. Meaning that, I can't just work in an office and, type away at a computer or whatever. It's like, I don't grow or flourish in something like that. And not that that's a bad thing to do with your life. It's just not right for me. So, I was a breech birth. I came out butt first. So I was challenging from the start. I think it all goes back to that, really, honestly. But I think also I've always just kind of been an oddball. Like, I don't know that I necessarily always fit in anywhere. And so I think there's somehow, some way that I find kinship with these people who are pushing into new areas of expression. I used to be more colorful on the outside when I was younger, but having had a couple injuries in my life, some of restrictive clothing I can't really wear anymore, or, belts or things like that. So I think I've become a little bit less apparent on the outside, but I think I'm still kind of that creative, nonconformist on the inside. And I just really, I'm drawn to people like that who are not going with the flow, right? People who are not just doing what they're told to do. These are people who are finding communities outside of the norm that are pushing boundaries, either, like body boundaries or performance boundaries or, stereotype boundaries or whatever. Like, they're just, they are challenging the norms of our society in some way, shape, or form. And a lot of them live on the fringe because of that. They, don't necessarily have the support. I'm not speaking for everybody, but, I'm sure there are people who are estranged from their families who are living in these ways, but have found new community with the people who are similar to them living in these ways. And that to me is interesting, when people choose to find their own family through these self-expressions.
Do you find, because we're associated with the Los Angeles Center of Photography and you have a lot of sort of friends there.
Yes.
But do you still feel like you have that sort of, as much as you like being with those people there, do you still feel that sort of disconnectedness that you may have felt? Because photographers are pretty, I don't want to say antisocial. That's not that's the right word. Kind of loners to sort of a great degree. And our interactions largely revolve around photography.
Right. I would say that's actually true for street photographers or the type of work that I'm doing with subcultures and whatnot. I don't know about portrait photographers or commercial photographers. They seem like they're probably not as lonely or isolated as a street photographer per se. Or a documentary photojournalist, or, I feel like we're kind of the ones who are working on our own in the trenches. So I'm sorry.
No, just in terms of just feeling like part of, because you were talking about these people are if they are not linked intimately with their families of birth, that they're basically recreating communities for themselves.
Right.
And since identity is largely a part of who you associate with, I'm wondering about, where do you find that community? Is that the photo community, or do you still find yourself, you like sort of meandering and moving through communities and spaces and not really establishing a particular loyalty to one group over another?
I think I have always, I'm a Gemini, so I think I have a lot of sides to myself. I mean, doesn't everybody who's not necessarily a Gemini? We all do. But I think that I have always been a chameleon throughout my life. I mean, like you said, I have this very eclectic background where I've changed my role, my professional role, several times. I have always wanted to be a million things, and that has led to that eclectic journey. I don't necessarily think that I don't belong in those communities. I mean, I feel like I do. I'm an advocate for them, and I also am I'm inspired by these people. Like I photograph them because I find beauty in what they do, and I really do act from a place of love and awe when I work with them. It's not that I don't want to portray them in a bad light. You know, I want the world to see what they're doing, and the fact that they live in these ways or find community in these ways. And then a lot of it is based around performance. So, they express themselves in these ways or perform in these ways. And I don't know what a lot of them do in their normal, day per se, because a lot of this stuff happens at night. So I don't know if somebody's, working a normal job during the day or not, or if they're just solely living within the performance aspect of these communities or somehow in these communities. But I am interested in them. I'm intrigued by them. Like I said, I never felt like I fit in a box in the 9-to-5 working world. So I'm curious about how people survive in that way. I feel like with exposure, we can all gain acceptance, and maybe people won't treat. I feel like there's a lot of, in the last several years, there's been a lot of kind of backwards behavior coming out where people are losing their rights, and that's not the direction that I feel the world should go. And I want to do what I can to help maybe shift it back in the direction it was going before the current change of the, the flow.
Yeah. That question is probably more of a reflection on me. Because I've never, like you, I've never felt like I sort of fit in.
Right.
And I found in that particular community that we were talking about, I feel like it's my ability to be of service to people that allows me to sort of fit in there rather than the fact that I'm just being myself, which is probably a disservice to me, but because to some degree I'm more comfortable in my skin today than I ever have before. Right. But in terms of how we choose to identify ourselves, it's really sort of interesting, the mechanics through which we find ourselves and find a community of people in which we feel safe and enriched by.
Right. So. And I'm sure that my openness to these lifestyles is also influenced by the fact that I did study with Catherine Opie and the fact that I did work with Grace Jones. I mean, my openness and my eclecticness and my, nonconformity had already taken me in those directions, right, with Kathy and Grace. So two people who also lived or associated with groups outside of the norms. So to me, that was just acceptable, right? I mean, there's color in there, there's diversity in there, there's interesting, mind-pushing things happening there, and also in the art realm, I came from art school, so I was already open to experimentation and things that are different and outside of the norm. performance art. Like there in New York, there was tons of performance art going on. When I was in college, there was tons of performance art going on. I was involved in performance art, so these cultures these subcultures that are performing in this way, to me, are just extensions of that. I mean, it's performance art. It's creating a persona that they don't have inhibitions with, that they don't feel like the world rejects them or whatever. I don't want to project their emotions, because I can't speak for the groups or, why they're doing it. Everybody has their own reasons. Mm-hmm. But I think that, they have sought out these communities to create their personas that they feel most comfortable with, revealing to the world in this way. We all need love and affection. Nobody can go through their life saying, I don't care about being accepted.
Right.
I mean, we all need it to some degree. So I like to highlight their creativity and the fact that they are living outside of the norm and pushing boundaries. And I find true beauty in that.
I love looking at your work. It's just the things you do compositionally, I just marvel at.
Thank you.
When the stuff that you've done with your dad, the stuff that you do with the burlesque, especially the stuff with the wrestling, it is just, I look at those and I just go.
Well, the wrestling, I have no control over any of that, so it really is just working a situation the best I can for that very split second moment. I mean,
well, you're doing it incredibly well. But even though you don't have control over what's happening with the wrestling, there is a consistency in all of your work in terms of framing and how you see, in terms of timing. How much of that is born from more than just taking a lot of pictures?
Well, I definitely keep myself going through continuing education. I mean, like we talked about, I'm involved in LA Center of Photography. I've studied with you. I've studied with other wonderful photographers there. And I always want to expand my toolbox. I mean, I never think that I know everything. And there's always something to learn or see in a new way. And sometimes you get stuck in ruts. And if you don't continue your education in some way, shape, or form, you will just kind of narrow your point of view, right? So I like to stay involved. I like to study with new people who come through there and can teach me, even if it's just one tool that I add to my toolbox, that's something new, and that will expand the way that I see the world and the way I work with my camera. I think it's important that everybody does that throughout their life. That you just, if you come to a point where you think you know everything, then I think your soul has died. Like there's always something new to learn.
It wasn't too long ago that the work that you did with your dad got profiled in the New York Times, and I think I sent you a message soon after.
You did.
And
yes.
It was like, oh my God, you seemed like you were getting inundated with so much attention. And it's as deserving as that work is for that attention, you're never really kind of ready for it, especially when it's so fresh. So tell me about dealing with all of that over the past 6 months or a year, or however long it's been.
It was intense. I mean, I think that piece was published on, I want to say it was August 31st of 2018. So yeah, it's just almost been a year. It was, well, number one, releasing that work into the world was very scary for me. I was fresh in the grieving process. I was nowhere near being done. I'm still not done. I don't know when done is. But I was very fresh in grief, and it just kind of happened. It wasn't like I sought it out. It happened organically and came to me in a very natural way through meeting Jonathan Blaustein at Exposure Weekend for LA Center of Photography, and I just happened to share that work in a workshop that I was taking with him. I brought 4 bodies of work to share in that workshop. I wasn't sure that I was going to share that work. I had not really shared that work much prior to that moment. I had shown it to a few people, but not really to many. And it certainly wasn't out in the world in any way, shape, or form. The only piece that I had given any images to was an Upworthy.com piece that I had been interviewed for about caregiving. And so I had given, I think, 3 images from the body of work to them just to illustrate the caregiving story. But I really hadn't spoken about the piece or the project as a whole, and I hadn't released more than those 3 images. And, I think those same 3 images I had already released on my Instagram page, but that was it. It's still overwhelming to put that work out into the world. But after Jonathan saw the work, he was blown away by it, and he really just felt like it should, he felt like Lens was the right place for that to be released. And, my dad and I had specific ideas behind how that work would function when he passed away. And it wasn't just to be released, anywhere per se,
Right.
but only on the best platforms where it could do the best work to help people. And when Jonathan came to me and said, the New York Times wants to publish that work, could it be a better platform? I couldn't turn that down, even though I may not have been ready personally in my grief process and to be able to confront the wave of response, whether negative or positive. I had no idea what I was going to see. But I knew that if I missed that opportunity, I may not have another one down the line that would be so, what's the right word? Like so honorable,
Right.
So I consulted my family and we all decided it was the right time to do it. And so I did. And the response was amazing and overwhelming. I really had no way to prepare for that either. I got messages from so many people that I did not know saying how much the work had moved them and how much it meant to them because they were either going through something similar or had experienced something similar, and they could recognize things in the photos that were familiar to their personal experience. And for me, that was eye-opening because I know that there's, so many people suffering from Parkinson's and dementia and, Sundowners too in the world. There's, millions, but there are moments in those photos that I thought were so unique to our family. Like I had no idea that that was actually a universal experience. And so for me, it was also eye-opening to learn that we had a bigger community than we thought we had. There are people who understood the image where, in the Times, they published an image where my father is sleeping in the bed and his finger is raised in the air, and it's a bird's eye shot of him, and the finger is in focus. He's slightly, so it's shallow depth of field, and so he's slightly out of focus in the background. And, this was something that would happen all the time with him when he would sleep. He would have hallucinations, I think, in his dreams, and his arm would gesticulate like that in a pointed fashion. And this happened on numerous occasions. And I got responses from people saying, I know that. Mm-hmm. I know that finger in the air. That happened with my dad.
There's a picture, I guess, either your mother or the assistant is helping your dad in the chair, I guess, in the bathroom.
My mom, yes.
And there's that waist belt?
Yes.
What is it called?
Yeah, I don't know what its technical term is, but yeah, it's like a gate belt or something.
Gate belt, exactly.
Yeah.
I wouldn't have recognized that 2 years ago.
Right.
I saw it in the photograph, I go, I know what that is.
Yeah.
I know what it's for.
Yep,
yeah.
Because you have that experience now.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. That, I'm sure, spoke to a lot of people, too. So did the teddy bear, the fact that my dad was communicating with the teddy bear, that became his baby. Also, there's a photo image of a portrait of him where he's sitting in our kitchen and the French doors are open behind him, and it's kind of this almost like a homage to a Renaissance painting or something, right, where this beautiful light is kind of flooding in from behind him, and it's just kind of shoulders up, and he's got the recliner chair cover on his head that he would often just pull off of there and put on his head because he wore it as a hat. It was just something he would do, right? A cute little funny behavior that we laugh at because it's humorous, but he just thought, I'm just going to put this on my head. And
as difficult as those circumstances are, there are those moments.
They are those moments
that
you cherish.
Moments that are just absolutely beautiful.
They're wonderful moments. And the funny thing is, other people had experiences like that too. And I didn't know this until that flood of response came in. So it was eye-opening for me, as scary as it was, as much as it felt like, my family is standing naked at the front of the room by exposing, this work. It really has made a difference in a lot of people's lives. I've made friendships across the world because of it. I have a friend in Ireland now, and I have a friend in New York who has a mother who is in the early stages of Parkinson's, and he just made a documentary film about her. It's like a new community has opened up for me through this. Yeah.
It's a wonderful legacy for both you and your dad.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, my last question that I ask each guest is I ask them to recommend another photographer for our listeners to discover and explore. And it can be anyone, someone you've long admired and someone you've recently discovered. So who would that be and why?
Well, it's really tricky because there's so many people I could just list off for hours. But I recently discovered two photographers, so I wanted to offer them up for this question. One is Lauren E. Simonuti, and both of these people are deceased, so you just have to research online for their work. But Lauren made haunting, beautiful, moving work about herself, dealing with her own mental illness and isolation. I think in 2006, she started hearing voices, and she was diagnosed with, and I'm quoting this because I've never heard of this before, but she was diagnosed with rapid cycling mixed state bipolar with schizoaffective disorder. And once she had that diagnosis, she made this body of work. It's incredible work, and I think everybody should see it. The other person is Stephen F. Arnold. I recently discovered his work. He is a surrealist visionary. He also has passed away, but he was a protege of Salvador Dali, and he was here from the LA area. He was diagnosed with AIDS in 1988 at the height of his popularity and died in 1994. So I think Fahey Klein has some of his work on view, possibly soon. I don't know. I know it's in their collection. I don't know where else they could see it other than online or possibly there if they live in LA.
Yeah, I'll find some links and I'll pass them on. But Safi,
awesome.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you. It was wonderful.
Thanks to Safi for sharing her time and story. You can find out more about her and her work by visiting flashbulbfloozy.com. And to find out more about Parkinson's disease, go to the American Parkinson's Disease Association at apdaparkinson.org. And in the show notes, you'll also find a link for resources for caring for elderly parents and relatives, provided by the American Society on Aging. Remember that you don't have to, nor should you do it alone. If you want to be the one to welcome listeners at the top of the show, as Mr. Tremblay did this week, just send us an audio file recorded on your phone, tablet, or computer saying something like, "This is Rebecca Smalls from London, England, and this is The Candid Frame." Say it at least a couple of times so we have a take to choose from. And include 3 to 4 seconds of silence with your voice to help us clean the audio. And make sure to include a link to your website, blog, or Instagram feed when you send it to info@thecandidframe.com. I have a variety of workshops and events coming up in the coming months, including one in May in Washington, D.C. at the Focus on the Story Photo Festival, a 2-day workshop in June at the Los Angeles Center of Photography, and a week-long cultural experience in Tokyo, Japan in December. I'm also finalizing details for a trip to Vancouver, Canada that I'll be announcing soon with a former guest from the show. You can find out more by visiting the website at thecandidframe.com. And if you want to get a sense of my teaching style and approach to photography, you should check out my YouTube channel where I offer critiques and evaluations of photography submitted by TCF listeners who contribute to the Candid Frame Flickr poll. You can check out the TCF Flickr poll and our YouTube channel by clicking on the link in the show notes and the website. I've been making the rounds promoting my latest book, Making Photographs, Developing a Personal Visual Workflow. And while the title may not be the sexiest, I'm pleased to hear that people who have picked up a copy are finding that it provides them new insight into how to see and make photographs. Whether you're new to photography or have been wielding a camera for years, I think you'll find some invaluable insights that will really transform your photography. You can order your copy today. When you place your order from the Rocky Nook website, use the promo code PORELLO40 to receive 40% off the list price. Check out the website and the show notes for the link. And if you want to keep up with all things Candid Frame, sign up for our mailing list, and you'll receive 3 free copies of my previously published ebooks. And if you like what you've been hearing on the show, please take the time to write a review in the iTunes, Spotify, the Google Play Store, or wherever you find and listen to podcasts. And if you write a review on a blog post, let me know and send me a link because I would really like to thank you on air. You can also support the show by making a monthly contribution through Patreon, or you can make a one-time contribution via PayPal. You'll find the links for both in the show notes and the website. Thanks to Yvonne Miller-Nixon, William Robbins, Frank Field, and David Moore for their recent contributions. Thank you so much. And if you want to easily access every episode of The Candid Frame, download the Candid Frame app. It's available for both Apple iOS and Android, and it's free. Download it today. You'll find it where everything else is in the show notes or the website at thecandidframe.com. And we also have an Alexa app, so if you have one of those smart devices, download the skill and listen to the show that way. The Candid Frame's audio engineer is Martin Taylor, who you can find at theothermartintaylor.com. The show's senior producer is Cynthia Parker, and our music is from Kevin MacLeod, whose royalty-free music can be found at incompetech.com. And you can follow me on Twitter and Instagram at simply @EbadianX. And this is EbadianX, and this is The Candid Frame.